All right, so we got another Patreon exclusive episode coming today. This is going to be a little bit more of a laid back one, right? So a lot of my Patreon exclusive episodes, we sort of go over things in a purely explanatory way. I try to cover a certain work or a certain thing and go into deeper detail and sort of elaborate on it as a whole. We're not really going to do that with this one. We're going to talk, though, about the German ideology with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Engels, whatever. I mispronounce his name all the time. We're going to go into detail about that, talk about the sort of shifting point of idealism to materialism. And honestly, we're going to talk a little bit about like where I think we are, where I think we can probably come to the best conclusions as far as materialism and idealism goes. The total ridiculous fucking war and battle that has been happening throughout the past 100+ years in philosophy, whatever. So we'll start off from there. So it is absolutely no secret Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx do not like the prior form of idealism of the sort of liberal Enlightenment project as a whole, as far as at least in the sense as it's baked in idealism, right? So Marx and Engels do talk about the revolutionary tonality that liberalism has taken on, especially sort of a later liberalism, right, through Rousseau, Engels, and and Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific talks about explicitly that the Enlightenment primed our minds, right? Reason primed our minds to understand that it is actually quite reasonable to see how reason is insufficient, right? And that's a really good way to put it, right? And if we're going to talk about where I am on this, that's good. That is certainly a better development, in my opinion, from the spirit, the Geist, and stuff like that from what we saw with Hegel and German idealists. So obviously, this will actually be one of our next YouTube videos on the channel. It's going to be over the German ideology. We'll cover it in its entirety. But we can go into a little bit more details about sort of idealism, materialism from here. And sort of kind of tear into that a little bit. So the entire book is essentially about, just as a whole, just as a baseline, it goes into detail about how German idealism, the idealism of the past, German philosophers, they are completely insufficient in their analysis of a total sort of like metaphysical way of looking at the world. It's not sufficient. It's not based in material. It's based in a purely abstract ideal. So, right from the this book, Marx and Engels says this, and this book is very aggressive. This is probably the most aggressive book aggressive writing I've ever seen Marx and Engels partake in. Engels is actually a bit more of an aggressive writer, I think, in some ways, in some later stuff that I've read. But we'll see. We'll cover this. Hitherto, men have constantly made up for themselves false conceptions about themselves, about what they are and what they ought to be. They have arranged their relationships according to their ideas of God, of normal man, etc. The phantoms of their brains have got out their hands. They, the creators, have bowed down before their creations. Let us liberate them from the chimeras, the ideas, dogmas, imaginary beings under the yoke of which they are pining away. Let us revolt against the rule of thoughts. Let us teach men, says one, to exchange these imaginations for thoughts which correspond to the essence of man. Says the second, to take up a critical attitude to them. Says the third, to knock them out of their heads, and existing reality will collapse. So, isn't this sort of like an admittance in a really weird way? Like, Marx and Engels sort of recognize that, look, they believe this shit so much it oddly is reality, and that's the scary part, right? They say that obviously for all of you guys who are patrons probably know the difference between materialism and idealism. They say that, look, consciousness derives from material upwards. And that's what they just said. There is a bit of a contradiction, right? But I think it's a focused one. I think they understand what they're doing. They're saying like, look, holy shit, these people are so fucking delusional. This is their life. This is the total reality. It is so wrong. It is so ideological in some ways that, dude, they're proving idealism right. They're willing it into existence. I find that kind of funny. But yeah, throughout the book, we get into Marx's sort of issues and Engels' issue with people like Hegel and Feuerbach. And it's really hilarious. This is the critical essence of where a philosopher wants to kill the father. And I notice a lot of older philosophy is more focused on that. Newer philosophy, not so much in some ways. But yeah, they are trying their best to totally make an independent, cohesive theory of stuff. It's really interesting how goddamn aggressive they are about people like Hegel in this book, when so much of their theory is based in Hegelian dialectics, or at least the form of dialectics, right? It's they have a materialist approach to dialectics, where dialectics, as it stands with Hegel, are far too idealistic. It's far too it's far too concretely based, or non-concretely based, in atmospheric sort of idealism. So right from the start, they talk about the illusions of German ideology as a whole. And they talk about the failures of young Hegelians. So people like Max Stirner, I think a few others they bring up. But throughout this, they're essentially trying to claim this is the beginning portion of Marx and Engels' journey, and trying to elaborate and explain why the hell materialism is the only way to go about a new philosophical endeavor, or a new theoretical outlook of the world. And so if we're going to get into the portion where I think, like, look, is this a good? It is, right? I think something like idealism, the idea that one, consciousness already sort of pre-exists. I think this is sort of a failure for sure, that consciousness itself is based in sort of the atmospheric realm, and it affects the material around us. I don't think they're necessarily wrong in some ways, but we'll get to that. There's a process in which this unfolds from where I see it, and I think a lot of later critical theorists have pointed this out. But what Marx and Engels do is they essentially flip it on its head. This is exactly where I think that Marx and Engels take a point where they're trying to kill the father so hard. It's like, I think the development of materialism, by definition, in so many ways with Marx and Engels, is a sort of vulgar materialism by default. And what I mean by that, I think when most people say vulgar materialism, they essentially talk about vulgar materialism being something where, in today's context, vulgar materialism is not accepting that there's things like identity, right? There's things outside of material or class and stuff like that. And in that sense, that's very much vulgar materialism, right? We've talked about numerous times where I do think the most concrete sort of objective nature of our being is class, right? It seems to be the most universal thing that encompasses us, even something more universal than who we sleep with, our sexual orientation, where we live, stuff like that. It seems like class is the universal baseline, and I'm there. But in this sense, there seems to be, I see a vulgar materialism here, where one, at least with other people, and I don't think this is the case with Marx and Engels, but one people you see materialism as materialism, and it's right because Marx and Engels said it. That's something that is undeniable. I think this is something that can happen. Is like whatever philosophical or theoretical plane of thought existed within Marx and Engels, it's just correct by default. There's a huge tendency to do this and not read Marx and Engels pretty critically, and I find anyways. And yeah, but that's actually not the problem I have. I find Marx and Engels, I don't know obviously what the intention was, but we're getting to a point, and some later critical theorists have pointed this out, where materialism on its own still it is still a little bit insufficient at explaining certain things. And probably the best way to approach idealism and materialism is through a concrete understanding of materialism as a process, right? Now, that's not antithetical to Marx and Engels, right? They understand materialism or anything being dialectical, right? It's a process that goes through something, right? It's ever changing and flowing. So if that is the case, I don't think we can stay in pure materialism anymore, can we? Right? So I think I've talked to a few people on stream. I've talked to a few people on here. I think some patrons and YouTube members, where I think we've came to pretty similar conclusions, where at this point we have had so much evidence of what seems to be, or at least what makes sense, rather, maybe not evidence, that might be a little strong, but what makes sense is that, look, materialism is the baseline, right? And we can thank Marx and Engels for that forever. Like, that's the development of materialism is incredibly important. Dialectical materialism, historical materialism, it is incredibly important. But I think what we see, the best materialist approach truly is to see how material ruptures, goes, and consciousness develops, right? This is something not inherently antithetical to Marx whatsoever. They're there, right? And then from material, consciousness develops. But then we get to a point where with that consciousness, your consciousness still will affect the material around you, right? So for example, we just released our video, The System of Objects. And this is where Baudrillard is where it's like, look, like we see that humans consume signs. They consume lifestyles in late capitalism. We consume air. It literally and figuratively. And Baudrillard didn't say this, but look at Goop, right? This brand Goop. I don't know exactly who makes this brand or who buys this shit, but it's like a jar. They'll sell a jar of air for like $1,000 or something, probably more, I think. And people fucking buy it. They'll buy that thing. People consume advertising in a sense. They consume advertising. It's important to say that advertising isn't something that, it isn't something that forces you. It isn't something that manipulates you into buying a product. Rather, it primes your mind to consume the sign of the product itself. Because what you're doing with advertising is you are quite literally consuming the fantasy in which it pushes forward, right? A Coca-Cola commercial will have people all together, everyone's standing happy, they're drinking Coca-Cola, everything's great. You know, you'll have your wife in the kitchen in a Kenmore oven in the 1960s, and there is an ideological tonality on how we should live, how you should consume, how you should structure your life through these signs that we're at a point where exchange value is getting much more muddy. And then from here, we're seeing sort of the collapse of raw materialism as we see it. And people will say, Marxists, I've heard Marxists say, this is just baldly idealist. I have no, so we're going to get a little, confrontational here, right? Because this isn't, I'm not just explaining stuff. I'm rather having a conversation, I would like to say, with you guys about where I see this from Marx and Engels to Baudrillard is that they say it's baldly idealist. I don't have, in some ways, that is like the true material dialectic, right? That is the true material process, right? I've never heard an argument that can sort of get away from that, right? Where it's like, look, material developed the conscious around us, consciousness as a whole was developed from material, sorry. And then after that, through time, we see so much real existing sort of historical evidence, right? In a material context, in a very concrete context, the context that Marx and Engels like, right? When you talk about history, Marx and Engels are very clear that production, human activity and material around us is the true driver of history. The true driver of history now in so many ways can be seen in an epoch of images, right? 1960s America, this sort of homogenous white family. And to say that that's not driven by human activity, by the material around us, seems very odd to me. But in another sense, we're seeing the rupture past pure materialism as materialism exist, right? So I think this is where a new sort of development of materialism should go to, right? And even here, I see Marx and Engels. There's so many small little bits where it just seems to fall a little bit short, right? I think in so many ways they try to kill the German idealists so hard that I think they miss a little bit of a future development of something like idealism. Which, to be fair, too, they didn't have Marx and Engels didn't have the sort of experience of post-industrial capitalism, right? Where industrial capitalism still exists here, right? But it's more of a regional endeavor in 2021, right? It's not a global phenomenon like it sort of used to be, right? Well, industrial capitalism, right, where Europe was an industrial region, and then, something like the global south was still quite communal, stuff like that. Now it's the opposite, not the opposite, where it's like today we are in like a post-industrial world with the global south being industrial in so many ways. And they didn't get to experience the post-industrial capitalist world. And so in that sense, it makes perfect sense, right? They weren't able to see this, have the same material evidence as people like Adorno, people like Baudrillard, people like Marcuse, critical theorists as a whole, especially a lot of early critical theorists, right? Oh, I made really good coffee today. Some days my coffee sucks dick. It sucks really bad. If you guys are coffee fans, pour over coffee can be pretty inconsistent, so you know what I'm talking about. But all right. So that's the entire development of this book, and I sort of wanted to make like a little short video of like kind of where my thought is, right? Because we've been exploring a lot of Marx lately, as a channel, more than we ever did before. We were primarily in the realm of critical theory, but I definitely wanted to go back to Marx. Just like critical theory is in my view, critical theory seems to be the natural dialectical movement of Marxism. We approach an extremely antagonistic realm of critical theory where, not really of critical theory, but of Marxism, where a lot of Marxists, they don't like critical theory. A lot of Marxism exists as a pretty anti-dialectical phenomenon, right? And this is exactly where I don't think it's just, a lot of people say like, I mean, critical theorists have said this, we need to go back a little bit more to Hegel. Zizek has said this as well. We kind of need to return to Hegel. We need to have a radical return to Hegel in some ways. I don't think that's actually necessary, right? And obviously Marxists are freaking the fuck out. Like, how dare you, right? Like, you're going to be burned at the cross. Like, how fucking dare you? The most ideological people are Marxist in so many ways. But I don't even think that's necessarily necessary, right? I think ultimately the natural conclusion that we can come to from this is that materialism and idealism through the process of dialectics is truly a false dichotomy. It is extremely hard to say that, look, no, materialism doesn't determine consciousness. It's very hard to say that, right? I mean, it's like, in my mind, a little bit impossible. But in the same vein, it's almost impossible in some context from the development of materialism to say that, look, idealism, ideas, consciousness doesn't affect the material around us. It does. We change the fundamental material around us to fit all kinds of weird signs and lifestyles and ideologies, right? This is something where I think in some ways Marxists don't talk enough about Marx and his commentary on ideology, right? Where Marx talks quite a bit about, well, he doesn't talk a lot about this, but where ideology is the false consciousness of the bourgeoisie. Marx is right with that in some ways, but Marx, his major development was the political economy, and the political economy is extremely good at elaborating on our current political phenomena around us, right? The exchange of political favors for economic return and so forth. The political economy does an extremely good job at developing developing this new world, it does a good job at analyzing this very economic and political sphere of things, right? But we don't talk enough about ideology, right? So in many ways, people on the left are very, and people in general are very quick to talk about how Wall Street funds political campaigns. They fund parties, stuff like that, and it's true, right? And that's a big deal, and that's a problem, right? And the political economy can show us this quite easily. But we don't talk enough about ideology, right? We don't actually talk enough about how there is an entire political apparatus that is reinforced from an ideological entity, right? But we don't talk about that a lot, right? And in some ways, that's baldly idealist. But I don't think so, right? Because you get to a point where it's really insufficient, right, to encompass this entire political realm with something like the political economy on its own, right? And with the oddly enough, something with the political economy, you get to a point where everything is quid pro quo in exchange, right? There's a fetish, and this is true outside of the political economy and politics. I think there is sort of a Marxist fetish with value and exchange, where it isn't just exchange, right? People like Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, specifically, they think they are doing the right thing, but they think they're doing the right thing because there is an entire ideological apparatus around them that tells them they're doing just what politicians should do, right? Yeah, it's probably, in their mind, they know that, yeah, there probably is some conflict of interest stuff here, right? But it's just like, it's happened forever, and I'm taking the brunt of it, and I'm just kind of making the best with what I got. That is their entire rationale, that they are working within capitalism, that they are working within this larger system of quid pro quo. And it's true, they are. But the thing that ties all of that together is ideology. The thing that ties markets and products together is the ideological tonality to it, right? This is something advertisers know so well. They know it so well, right? Baudrillard does such a wonderful job of talking about this, where advertisers, they hire, and I think this is still true today, where the number one employees for advertising agencies, they're not like marketers. They're psychology majors. They're people who understand the sort of psychological underpinnings of our nature, or they're supposed to, right? We all know that just because you have a psychology undergrad doesn't mean you really, like you're really all that qualified on a psychological level. But nonetheless, like theoretically, they have those credentials. And that's ultimately what's important to show there is that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for mass marketers in general. They're looking for people who understand the sort of subconscious underpinnings of our psychological nature. And that's the entire goal, right? And in that sense, what's more ideological than that in some ways, right? What is more, in some ways, idealistic, something that exists in the atmosphere that affects the material around us and how we consume and the value of things, right? It's I don't know. I think because we're making another video, we're making our next video on the German ideology. It's the next Patreon exclusive, or not exclusive. It's the next Patreon voted and chosen video. But I think that when you go back and read this compared to other theory, especially theory that deals with sort of newer psychoanalysis and semiotics, you see they're close. They're really close. Marx and Engels is very close, but they miss something, and it's sort of how there's a reverse effect with materialism, where through what likely seems to be the process of materialism, we see a reverse order into a process of idealism, right? And that dichotomy can be broken down very, very fast. And it's something that we need to take a lot more seriously, right? I couldn't go out on a whim and talk about this, but you guys who support on Patreon, I know you guys like this stuff a lot. I think this is important stuff. I talk about this with a lot of people, but a lot of people seem to be kind of shocked. I never thought about it like that. But a lot of, which kind of surprises me because it's a big sort of critical theory thing, but nonetheless, that's okay. I'm probably just going to keep this pretty short, guys. It's probably going to be about a 30-minute long video, 30-minute long video. But I wanted to talk about a little bit of the development from Marx and Engels to people like people like Baudrillard and later critical theory. This goes a lot into the dialectic of enlightenment as well, with Horkheimer and Adorno. There's a lot of stuff there with that, but nonetheless, just making the system of objects video, I feel like we have a little bit of a baseline for anyone who hasn't read those works. And we can make a material referent to what I'm talking about. But yeah, through the process of materialism, this is kind of the conclusions. Marx and Engels were close. I think we need to change our outlook on what vulgar materialism is. I think vulgar materialism can be a little bit something that's a little bit more broad, right? We use vulgar materialism as something that it's just people who don't accept identity, right? This is something that a lot of Marxists will talk about. A lot of Maoists specifically will talk about how that is the true definition of vulgar materialism, and we need to change that. I don't think that goes far enough. I think vulgar materialism is not seeing the true dialectical process of materialism as a whole into the realm of idealism. Nonetheless, the German idealists didn't quite look at it in those lenses either, right? In some ways, it wasn't a dialectical process of material itself. And so I think in some ways, like, we truly do need the merging of German idealism. Capitalism itself, especially late capitalism, reverts back to German idealism far more than what we'd ever expect. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, kind of like covering Marx to Baudrillard. Figured we'd just have a small little tiny discussion I'd put up for you guys. I haven't been able to make a lot of Patreon exclusive videos. I've been so busy lately, stuff like that. But yeah, I appreciate all you guys. Should be about a 30-minute long video, but I will see you guys later.